Sri Ramana Puranam Sri Ramana Sri Ramana
இது கிட்டத்தட்ட நம்ம கலர் தான் வரும். நம்ம சூஸ் பண்ண கலர் தான் அது.
Sri Ramana Namo Bhagavate Om Namo Bhagavate Sri Ramanaya. We can start with our Ramana Puranam Satsang today. We will begin with our invocatory verse. This is a verse in Tirumandiram in praise of Lord Ganesha, requesting him to bestow grace to understand the task at hand, which is to understand Ramana Puranam as composed by Muruganar and Bhagavan. ஐந்து கரத்தனை யானை முகத்தனை இந்தி இளம்பிறை போலும் ஈற்றனை நந்தி மகந்தனை ஞான கொழுந்தனை புந்தியில் வைத்தடி போற்றுகின்றேனே. So far we have been seeing the first section of Ramana Puranam. In the very first section, Muruganar highlighted the importance of Mahamantra, Namo Ramanaya, with which the first line begins, Namo Ramanaya Nalampera Valga, Vimochana Mayyan Viraimalarthal Valga, அடிமுடிக்கு உண்டாய அநாதித் தொடர்பின் விடமுடியா மெய்மறந்து விட்டுழல் புன் நாயேனை பக்திமால் ஏற்றி அகப்பட்டி மனத்து ஊனமறு சுத்தியால் அங்கவடித்து உய்யச் சுடர் தோற்றித் தவவிரத ஞானத் தழல் வேள்வி வேட்பித்து அவபிரத நோக்க அமுது ஆட்டி ஆண்டபிரான் விண்ணாடரும் சுவைக்க வேணவா கொண்டுவிழை கண்ணாரமுதக் கடவுள் உமையோடு திருக்கயிலாயத்தில் சிறக்க குழுவீற்று இருக்கையிலே ஏய்ந்த பதினெண்கணமும் கண்களிக்க ஊங்கு பரபக்தி உருத்தெரிய பக்குவர்க்கு பாங்கு பெற நீ போய் பயின்றொழுகிக் காட்டுக என ஆருயிர் மாட்டின்ப அருளாற்றல் ஒன்றே தன் காரியமா கொண்ட அக்கண்ணுதலோன் கூறபவன் சந்நிதியை விட்டுத் தனவாது தற்பரமாம் தன்னதுயிர் தத்துவத்தைத் தானறிந்து பேதமறு நேசம் பயில் சகஜநிட்டன் குடமுழ நந்தீசனே வாசகனாய் ஏய்ந்தது கொண்ட அவ்வுழுவல் மூண்ட அழல் போன்று முருகலான் முக்தி நெறிக்கு ஆண்ட கழலன்றி அறியா பரவசத்தில் சந்தனடை சான்ற தமிழ்நாடன் வாசிதர தந்த நிதித்திரளின் தன்ம விசேடத்தால் குருமூர்த்தமாக குலவிய தன் கோவில் பரமார்த்தம் என்று அப்பணியில் செலவிடவே கிங்கரரால் வேந்தழைக்க கேட்டு மதி மாழ்கலான் சங்கரனாம் தன்னடியில் சார்ந்து குறைசாற்ற விலைமதிக்கலாகா விரிசுடர் மாணிக்கம் சலமனத்தன் கண்டுமகிழ சார முதல் உய்த்து நரித்திரளை நாம பரியாக்கிக் கொண்டு அவ்வரிமர்தனன் செய் அருந்தவர்த்தால் கண்முன் மரகத மாணிக்கம் மயங்கு எழிலோடு சொல் துரகதமா உந்து அரசன் சோத்த மகிழ்ந்து ஏற்றருளி கொள்ளுக என தான் கயிறுமாறி கொடுத்தலும் அந்நள்ளிரவே முன்னை நரிகளாய அப்பரிதாம் ஊரை அவலமுறுத்து ஊளையிட்டு கொண்டோட. So we ended at this juncture last week where Muruganar concludes the first portion of Lord Shiva's Leela when Mickkavachagar takes the money that the king of Pandya gives him to go and acquire high quality horses. Maunikavachagar, acting on Lord Shiva's commands, goes and spends that money in building a temple to worship Lord Shiva as his own guru for the benefit of humanity and for all of us to pray unto him. That temple is at Avudayar Kovil. And when the king's servants come and ask him for the status of those high quality horses, Maunikavachagar surrenders himself to the Lord, not knowing how to answer. The Lord commands him to go and first give some high quality gems to please the king, whose mind is constantly wavering. The king was initially pleased to see those high quality gems, however, becomes restless for not seeing those horses, realizing that restlessness, and because of Harimardana Pandya's prior penance, the Lord himself comes and hands him over what appears to be high quality horses, but they are nothing but jackals converted into those high quality horses by the Lord himself. Not knowing the reality, not knowing the fact that the Lord himself appeared in front of him, Harimardana Pandya prostrates and salutes the Lord for giving him the material things, such as those high quality horses. But those horses, assuming their natural dispositions, run away that very night. And that illusion, when it unraveled, created chaos in the entire country. And those jackals not only made noise, but also ate those real horses that the king had in his yard. So naturally, when the king learned about it, he was extremely angry. So before we go to the next section, this is where we ended. This episode of jackals being converted into the horses were variously hailed. Maunikavachagar himself relates to this divine intervention in very many verses in Tiruvachakam. The first verse in which this appears is Anandamalai of Tiruvachakam, in which he says, Nariyai Kudirai Pariyaki Nyalamellam Nigalvittai. Nyalam is the world, Yellam is the whole world, Nigalvittai. Your divine power manifests and runs the entire world. And he gives an example of the divine power in the very first section, Nariyai Kudirai Pariyaki. Nariyai is referring to the jackals. Kudirai Pari is referring to those horses. So, like how you made jackals as horses, that very divine power is the one that runs and manifests this world. So, that's what Maunikavachagar himself says, referring to that particular episode in his verse. And his references are very impersonal. He doesn't refer that particular example as a thing that he had witnessed or as an intervention that particularly saved him, because at the time of composition of Tiruvachakam, Maunikavachagar did not retain his old personality and his ego. Therefore, his point of referring to this is not to give us a biographical statement, rather about appreciating the divine manifestation and the divine intervention that Lord Shiva bestows upon all those who surrender upon him. So, Nariyai Kudirai Padarayaki Nyalamellam Nigalvittai is his way of praising the Lord for sustaining, manifesting, and ending the world as his own divine intervention or his divine powers. As we saw in the last session, Upper has made several references of Manikavachagar's life in his verses in Devaram. And this particular event, where Lord Shiva converts jackals into horses, had been referred by Upper in two entirely different verses. The first one is Nariyai Kudirai Saivanam, Naragarai Devu Saivanam. So here Upper explains the wondrous power, that transformative power of Lord Shiva, who controls the extremes that appear to manifest. So the first one he says is Naragarai Deva Saivanam. Naragar are those who dwell in hell, and he converts them to the ranks of the pious celestials. Devu is Devas, who are celestials, are pious celestials. Naragar are those who've been cursed to live in hell. So the emphasis here is Lord Shiva's divine manifestation, and he gives the first example, Nariyai Kudirai Saivanam. He who converted jackals into horses is the very Lord who also converts those who are in hell into heaven. In other words, our thoughts which pull our attention externally are those that create hell in us. And those very thoughts, when they are turned inwards, become beautiful as those high quality horses, and that is referred to as the pious celestials. So both actions are because of the presence of the Lord and because of his divine power. So that's what Upper says in that. Yet again, in a slightly different verse, he refers to the same exact incidents. Nariyanar Pariya Mailhindrador Periyanar. Periyanar is referring to the Lord as the supreme being. Mahilhindrador, he becomes happy. How does he become happy? Nariyanal Pariya. When those jackals become horses, he becomes happy. In other words, those thoughts, instead of being externalized in search of material things and in search of those material happiness that are given to us when we acquire things that we want or disown things that we do not want, those very thoughts, when they become pious thoughts, are those thoughts that actually take us towards the being or towards the devoted personal God that we praise. That very turn of events makes the Lord happy. Remember, Muruganar in a separate instance says, the whole grace of Lord Shiva exists only to bestow happiness to every being that is manifested in the world. So, in both these references, Upper gives the example of jackals being converted into horses, referring to the episode that happened in Manikavachagar's life as a divine play and divine intervention by the Lord. So, now continuing to those next three lines, lines number 38 to 40 of Ramana Puranam, Muruganar continues the story. So, having experienced the exit of those horses into jackals and the chaos that unfolded, the Lord commands to see Mickkavachagar next day morning, and he begins the conversation. யாரை நீர் மாயம் செய்தீர் என்று அடிகளை வேந்து உள்ளம் காய்ந்து ஆற்ற ஒருத்தலுமே வையைக் கண் வெள்ளம் பாய்ந்து ஊர்மேல் விரைவதனைத் தட்க. So the first line is a quote given by the king addressing Mickkavachagar. யாரை நீர் மாயம் செய்தீர் என்று அடிகளை வேந்து உள்ளம் காய்ந்து ஆற்ற ஒருத்தலுமே வையைக் கண் வெள்ளம் பாய்ந்து ஊர்மேல் விரைவு அதனை தட்க. தட்க is to stop. விரைவு அதனை, coming fast, coming quickly to stop. So what is being stopped here quickly? The first section explains that. யாரை நீர் மாயம் செய்தீர் என்று. யாரை நீர் மாயம் செய்தீர். Mayam is deceiving with trickery. யாரை நீர். Whom did you trick with your deceiving actions? யாரை நீர் மாயம் செய்தீர். Or the king is asking, have you deceived me with your trickery? The trickery here is bringing those horses, which were originally jackals, and of course they left them, and the king was furious and enraged by that betrayal. The king was extremely angry at Mickkavachagar, and that's referred to as என்று அடிகளை வேந்து. Vendu is Vendan or the king. Adigal is he who surrendered at the feet of the Lord. So here it refers to Mickkavachagar because he is the surrendered devotee in the story. என்று அடிகளை வேந்து உள்ளம் காய்ந்து ஆற்ற. He is shouting at him. உள்ளம் காய்ந்து, with his heart full of rage. Or he is angry, and when anger possesses one's heart, they become barren and devoid of love and compassion. And when that happens, the king loses the perspective of trying to understand what got Mickkavachagar to do those actions that he did. And if he had paused to listen, he would have understood Mickkavachagar's supreme state of abiding in the self. And since he did not pause to understand that, and that was because he was possessed by his material desires, and when those desires were not fulfilled, he became angry. And because of that anger, he shouted at Mickkavachagar, and moreover, he punished him. Uruthalame. And how did he punish him? So he asks Mickkavachagar to be kept in the banks of Vaigai River in the middle of the day in the scorching sun. And that was unbearable pain. Yet Mickkavachagar did not move away from abiding in the self. He completely accepted what is happening to him as the divine Leela of the Lord. And in order to stop that, Viraivu Adanai Tatka, in order to stop his dear devotee being punished, the Lord acted. And how did he act? Vaiyai kan vellam paindu urmel. The river Vaigai became swelling and overflowing and therefore flooding the city because of the divine play of the Lord. So because of the grace manifested by the Lord, the river Vaigai was flooding, and that flood came over the banks. So first of all, it cooled down the temperature, and because the river was overflowing, the servants, the king, and Mickkavachagar had to move away. And there is also a spiritual message in this, which is despite the shame that came with those jackals being converted into horses, despite the fact the money was spent in building the temple that was given for the purpose of acquiring those high quality horses, and the king, who was his master or who was his boss, was shouting at him angrily and punishing him, Mickkavachagar never moved away from abiding in the self or abiding at the feet of the Lord. And when that level of conviction is exhibited by a devotee, remember all of the actions that Mickkavachagar did, whether it was logical or not, whether it made sense or not, he simply abided in the self and he listened to the commandments of the Lord and he acted accordingly. For such a devotee, when they encounter any of those pains, whether it is a physical, emotional, or spiritual pain, the Lord comes in quickly to help save them. And that is why this section is very important, where the Lord is shown to give his grace to his devotees through various manifestations only to end the pain and to save them from having to absorb the consequences of those actions that are performed while completely abiding in the self. So the emphasis is surrender, the emphasis is acting according to the commandments of the Lord. And if those actions were done using the individual personality or the individual mind of Mickkavachagar, those consequences and those reactions would have been felt by the individual. Since those actions were performed purely in an Advaitic sense, those reactions also did not bother Mickkavachagar. So let's look at this again. யாரை நீர் மாயம் செய்தீர் என்று அடிகளை வேந்து உள்ளம் காய்ந்து ஆற்ற ஒருத்தலுமே வையை கண் வெள்ளம் பாய்ந்து ஊர்மேல் விரைவு அதனை தட்க. Having asked him, who did you deceive? The king punished Mickkavachagar, and to stop that very quickly, the Lord manifested as flooding in Vaigai river and showing his divine display to end the pain for Mickkavachagar. So with that, we'll go to the next section, which is lines 41 through 47. அடியார் இறந்த குறை ஆண்டானாம் தன் பொன் முடியால் நிறைவேற்றும் மோத தயாமூர்த்தி அனநியமா தன்னை அடைந்த சரணத்தால் கனநியமச் சான்றோரும் கண்டு தொழத்தக்காள் முதுவந்திக்கு ஆளாய் முயன்று முடிமேலே மதுவந்த பிட்டுக்கு மண் சுமக்கலுற்று பிறம்படித்தான் உண்ட விசித்திரத்தால் தானே. So the first two lines of this particular section gives the explanation of how the Lord protects those surrendered devotees. அடியார் இறந்த குறை ஆண்டானாம் தன் பொன் முடியால் நிறைவேற்றும் மோத தயாமூர்த்தி. Modam is happiness. Dayamurti is the Lord who's of the form of compassion, or the Lord who manifests grace. So the Lord who manifests compassion becomes happy when he fulfills the desires of those who surrendered unto his feet. Adiyar here is those who surrendered. Adiyar is a generic term that's used in the Tamil literature to refer to those ascetics who have surrendered themselves at the feet of the Lord. Adiyar literally means those who live in the feet, or servants, or those who have no other manifested work except to do the work of the Lord. Adiyar, iranda kurai. Iranda is to beg, kurai. Whatever complaints they may have, Andanam, the Lord, Tan Pon Mudiyal Niraivetrum Bodha Daya Murti. He would take it upon himself, meaning those requested acts of the Lord, of those devotees, those requested actions by those devotees are taken up as golden acts upon the head of the Lord, meaning he takes them as a priority and he fulfills them. And by fulfilling, Niraivetram is fulfilling, he gets happiness. Who gets the happiness? Dayamurti, the Lord who is of the form of compassion. So here it said, the Lord becomes happy fulfilling those requests by those who surrendered unto him. And that's his priority. Again, why is that a priority? Muruganar himself says in his previous lines that the entire grace of Shiva manifests to bestow the perfect bliss to those who surrendered unto him. That's his sole wish, and that alone makes him happy. Here he repeats the theme in slightly different way, that the actions requested by those who surrendered, remember, once devotees surrendered, they don't retain their former ego. So these requests are not egoic requests. And when such requests are made, because of the circumstances they find themselves in, the Lord manifests to fulfill those requests, and in fulfilling, he finds immense happiness. Who finds immense happiness? The Lord. So he makes that statement and he gives an example to the statement in the next 4 lines. And here he introduces another character called Muduvanti. Muduvanti is an old lady who surrendered unto the Lord by constant self inquiry and abiding in the self. And in such abidance, Lord Shiva grants her wish and fulfills them. And because of her high spiritual status, even those pious religious elders worship at seeing her. அனநியமா தன்னை அடைந்த சரணத்தால் கனநியமச் சான்றோரும் கண்டு தொழத் தக்காள் முதுவந்திக்கு ஆளாய் முயன்று முடிமேலே மதுவந்த பெட்டுக்கு மண் சுமக்கலுற்று பிறம்படித்தான் உண்ட விசித்திரத்தால் தானே. So there are 3 different things being explained here. First, Muruganar introduces Muduvanti. The way that he introduces Muduvanti is these 2 lines. Ananiyama தன்னை அடைந்த சரணத்தால் கனநியம சான்றோரும் கண்டு தொழ தக்காள். Takkar is the feminine word of takkar, which refers to virtuous elders. And takkar here is a virtuous woman or elderly woman. Elderly not in the sense of age alone, but also in terms of wisdom. And the wisdom comes because of the following. Ananiyama tannai அடைந்த சரணத்தால். Saranam is to surrender. That surrender is not verbal. It's an unconditional surrender. And that happens because of the first 3 words that are describing that surrender. Ananiyama tannai அடைந்த. Tannai அடைந்த is abiding in the self. Ananiyama is in a non-dual way, or abiding in the self completely with undivided attention to the self, without being distracted by the mind, meaning the state of being where the mind is completely absent, where the individual is in complete union, so to say, in samadhi or Sagaja Samadhi, as Bhagavan refers, and that state is the surrendered state. So Muruganar refers to that as Ananyama Tannai Adainda Saranatal. Because she is in the continuous bliss of being in the self, Gana Niyama Sandrorum Kandu Toya Takal. And that is why she is Takal, meaning the one who is supremely wise. And because of her wisdom, Gana Niyama Sandrorum Kandu. Gana Niyamam. Niyamam is religious duties. Gana Niyamam is fully doing rituals and religious activities. Sandrorum. Those wise people look at her and praise her and prostrate in front of her. She's in that supreme state. And that supreme state comes because of her complete abidance in the self. Ananiyama Tannai Adainda Saranatal Gana Niyama Chandrorum Kandu Toya Takkal. And he reveals the name of that Takkal, Muduvanti. So the story goes, which is implied in this section, when Vaigai River began overflowing, the king allocates every section of that river to be filled with mud by every individual of the city. So it's a collective work so that they protect the city. And Muduvanti, who is a citizen of that country and the citizen of that particular area, also get an allotment to fill with mud. Because of her old age and because of her lack of physical strength, she prays to the Lord asking for help because she couldn't possibly go and do that heavy physical work. And here, exactly why Muruganar prefaced saying, those devotees who surrendered when they had legitimate asks, Bhagavan would come down and act on them because of his grace, and fulfilling such requests gives him immense pleasure. So here, for example, Muduvanti, when she asked, Bhagavan, Lord, came down as a servant. So Muduvantikku Alai. Alai in this case is to be subservient to her asks. Muyendru Mudimele. He took it upon his head to act. And in exchange, Muduvanti gives pittu. Pittu is a dish prepared by Muduvanti, and Muruganar describes as Madhuvanda Pittukku. So pittu is made out of rice flour and coconut, and it's well represented in ancient literature, and there are many references to this pittu in throughout in the ancient, even Sangam period, as a staple that was consumed by those who lived at that time. And because that pittu was made by Muduvanti, who was a devotee of the Lord found it like honey. It says Madhuvanda pittukku. When devotees make food, the Lord accepts them lovingly and as if it tasted like honey. And we know from Bhagavan's own examples that to be true. For example, when Mudalayar Patti, even in her old age, when others dissuaded her cooking because perhaps her cooking was not to their liking, Bhagavan found it to be like honey and he ate that until the very end. And very similarly, here, Lord Shiva accepted that pittu, and no matter what others might find it to be, he found it to be like honey because of her devotion and surrender. And that surrender is not only appreciated by him, but also those who do pious rituals, the extreme rituals in praise of the Lord, even those who actually would prostrate in front of her because of her abidance in the self. அனநியமா தன்னை அடைந்த சரணத்தால் கணனியமச் சான்றோரும் கண்டு கொழத் தக்காள் முதுவந்தி முதுவந்திக்கு முதுவந்தி. So that's முதுவந்தி. முதுவந்திக்கு ஆளாய் became servant முயன்று முடிமேலே. He took it upon himself to act, and in exchange madhuvanda pittukku, he ate because she had no other money to give him. She paid his wages through giving him pittu that she cooked, and he took it as if it tasted like honey. He mansumakkalutru, he went about doing the work by lifting huge amounts of mud from other pots and started fortifying the banks so that the river would not overflow and to stop the floodwaters. The Lord, being who he is, who wants to perform divine leelas, starts playing in the water, and he starts swimming, he stops frolicking, which catches the attention of those servants who are overseeing that work by every citizen. And they take him aside and present him in front of the king. And the king inquires about his frolicking, and the king gets angry and he beats him and he strikes him with a cane. And that is the last line. Pirambadi than unda vichitratal thane. So when he gets struck by the cane, that pain is felt by everyone in the city. And that is the magical divine power of the Lord, Vichitram. Vichitram is an abnormal act or a special act or an act through divine power. So here, three different sections are being represented. The first section, Muruganar makes a statement about the divine power of the Lord, the grace of the Lord, which is always there to help those who surrender unto him. And he gets immense pleasure to fulfill such surrender devotees' requests. And as an example of that, he introduces Mudhuvanti, who requests the Lord to come and help her to fulfill the duty that's assigned by the king, which is to fortify a section of the city against rising floodwaters. And because she's completely abiding in the self, as Ananiyama Tannai, in a non-dual way, without her mind interfering in such abidance, even those who are pious religious ritualists prostrate in front of her for her supreme state of wisdom. And the Lord appears joyfully to begin to work for her as her servant. And in exchange, she gives pittu, and he accepts that as if it's honey, and he begins to lift. And during that, he shows his leela by playing and not appreciating the divine play. Servants show him to the king. The king beats him up, and that pain is felt by everybody. So that is that intense section is covered in this 8 lines. அடியார் இறந்த குறை ஆண்டானாம் தன் பொன்முடியால் நிறைவேற்றும் மோத தயாமூர்த்தி அனநியமா தன்னை அடைந்த சரணத்தால் கனநியம சான்றோரும் கண்டுகொழத்தக்காள் முதுவந்திக்கு ஆளாய் முயன்று முடிமேலே மதுவந்த பெட்டுக்கு மண் சுமக்கலுற்று பிறம்படி தான் உண்ட விசித்திரத்தால் தானே. So this Leela is actually documented by Mickkavachagar in Tiruvachakam. Again, he writes that in an impersonal way. In this particular verse, தின்போர் விடையான் சிவபுரத்தார் போரேறு மண்பால் மதுரையிற் பிட்டமுது செய்தருளி தண்டாலே பாண்டியன் தன்னை பணிகொண்ட புன்பாடல் பாடி நாம் பூவல்லி கொய்யாமோ. So பூவல்லி கொய்யாமோ is a act by maidens who compose songs while they pluck flowers. And in here, the joyous songs are referring to Lord Shiva's divine power. And the divine power that's being referred to is the act in which he appeared to help Muduvanti. And accepting the pittu, he also shows Pandya king his supreme form. And while accepting Pandya king's striking, he patiently accepted and bore the wound and yet made everybody feel the same exact pain. So all of that is referred in these 4 lines. Thinpor Vidayan Sivaparattar Poreru. Thinpor Vidayan, riding in the sacred bull. Sivaparattar Poreru. He is the guardian of all those who live in the field of Shiva. Sivaparattar is those who live in the abode of Shiva, or those who live in the city of Shiva, or in this case, those who live in a completely surrendered state. He becomes the guardian. And again, that example is given in the next line. Manpal Madariyil Pittamudu Seidaruli. He descended down to the earth and he went to Madurai, where the whole scene that was previously referred to by Muruganar was happening. Manpal Madariyil Pittu Amudu Seidu Aruli. Here also he refers to as Pittu as Amudu, which is as nectar. Whereas in the prior section, you see Muruganar referring to Pittu as honey. Here he refers to as nectar. This verse is by Mickkavachagar, and it is nectar because of Muduvanti's love, Muduvanti's surrender. Pittu Amudu Seidu Aruli. He graced the wish of Muduvanti by eating the puttu that she lovingly gave him. Tandale Pandiyan Tannai Panigunda Punpadal. Tannai Panigunda. He became the servant of Muduvanti, and in effect, he became the servant of the king in fulfilling the duty that was assigned to every citizen of that country. Tandale Pandiyan, the king, Pandya king, struck him using a cane, and that wound he bore patiently. And let us sing the divine glories of such a being. Padal Padi Nam Puvalli Koyomo. Let's go and pluck those flowers. தின்போர் விடையான் சிவபுரத்தார் போரேறு மண்பால் மதுரையில் பிட்டமுது செய்தருளி தண்டாலே பாண்டியன் தன்னை பணிகொண்ட புன்பாடல் பாடி நாம் பூவல்லி கொய்யாமோ. This verse is being referred to in the prior section by Muruganar, in which he says, Gananiyama Chandrorum Kanduvarathakkal Muduvandikku Alai Muindru Mudimele Madhuvanda Pettukku Mansumakkalutru Perambadi Thanunda Vichitharathal Thane. So that Leela unfolds the divine play manifests the king who becomes enraged because of what he perceived to be Mickkavachagar's betrayal, now begins to understand the reality that always existed within him and in front of him. That is the next section. Varambilavam ettu vadivadal kaatti அமைச்சர் பெருமை அரசர்க்கு உணர்த்தி தமை சிவ வாழ்க்கைக்கே சரிக்க விடுத்து அப்பால் அழகுமலி தில்லை பொன்னம்பலம் சாரென்ன தழுவு சிவஞான தபோதனரை ஏவி மனவாசகம் கடந்தும் மத்தமனப் பேயேன் சொனவாசகம் விழைந்த சொக்கப் பெருமான். So here there are some beautiful metaphors used by Muruganar to explain what has happened subsequently. வரம்பு இலவாம் எட்டு வடிவாதல் காட்டி அமைச்சர் பெருமை அரசர்க்கு உணர்த்தி. Varambu is boundary. Varambu ilavam is boundless or infinity. So what is infinity? The form of the Supreme Being. And that Supreme Being manifested in 8 different forms in his conscious world or the awakened world or this manifested world. And Bhagavan also refers to these 8 forms in Upadesa Saram Ashtamurtibir, those 8 forms. And what are those 8 forms? They represent the 5 elements: earth, water, fire, air, and space, the moon, the sun, and the individual jiva. Those are the 8 forms manifested by the Lord, and that is of infinite size or boundless presence. And such boundless manifestation was revealed to the king. And we know from the prior section, this is all because of the penance that the king performed in his prior lives. Although the Lord was in front of him as the guy who gave those horses, as the guy who did the work for Muduvanti, the king failed to recognize his presence. Now gets this Vishwarupa Darshan, or the supreme view of the Lord, who manifests in 8 different forms. And we see a similar manifestation of the Lord in Bhagavad Gita, in which Lord Krishna shows his cosmic form to Arjuna in the middle of the battle or in the beginning of the battle. So very similarly, here Harimardana Pandya gets the vision of the manifested being in infinite form, who otherwise appeared in 8 different forms in this manifested world, consisting of the 5 elements, the moon, the sun, and the jiva, or the individual jivas. Remember, they are all the same exact being, the Supreme Self, but the manifestation, the physical manifestation, are those that appear in those 8 different forms, and they are different only from an onlooker's perspective, not from the perspective of the self. And the king realizes the error he had committed, and he apologized and sought forgiveness. And how did that happen? Again, Muruganar says that also happened because of the divine power of the Lord and the grace of the Lord. அமைச்சர் பெருமை அரசர்க்கு உணர்த்தி. அமைச்சர் in this case is the prime minister, who is Mickkavachagar. Perumai is his supreme status or the spiritual strength. அரசர்க்கு உணர்த்தி. Arasar is the Pandya king. Unarthi is made him understand. So the king awakened to his error, sought forgiveness, and the Lord graciously forgave him and also gave him what everybody would seek: a vision of his supreme manifestation in 8 forms. In addition, the Lord also gives Mickkavachagar the spiritual strength to renounce and resign his ministerial job and accept the life of an ascetic and calls upon him to come to Punnambalam, which is Tillai or Chidambaram. So here the next two lines explain that section. தமை சிவ வாழ்க்கைக்கே சரிக்க விடுத்து அப்பால் அழகு மலி தில்லை பொன்னம்பலம் சார்கென்ன. தமை சிவ வாழ்க்கைக்கே சரிக்க. Tamai here refers to Mickkavachagar. Siva Valkai is the life in praise of the Lord, or a life led by that person who completely abides in Lord Shiva. Sarikka Vidittu, he bestows that grace and strength, and therefore Mickkavachagar resigns his job, gives up all material duties and any engagements that's not of Lord's commandments, meaning he accepts only the action that's commanded by Lord from that point on. தமை சிவவாழ்க்கைக்கே சரிக்க விடுத்து அப்பால், after that, அப்பால் is after that, அழகு மலி தில்லை பொன்னம்பலம் சார்கென்ன. Then the Lord commands Mickkavachagar to come to Tillai, which is a place that's currently called as Chidambaram, and Chidambaram has the trees of Tillai. They are a particular type of bushes, they are abound, and therefore that is also called as Tillai, and in which the temple, Chidambaram temple, exists, which is also called as Punnambalam. Punnambalam is the golden courtyard. Ambalam is the space, or the space in which the Lord performs his dance, the cosmic dance. So Tillai Punnambalam, it refers to there is a physical manifestation of that at Chidambaram, the temple in which he is supposed to be dancing in his cosmic form, but also can refer to the self in which his presence is felt by those who surrender unto him. அழகு மலி தில்லை அழகு மலி தில்லை பொன்னம்பலம் சார்கென்ன தழுவு சிவஞான தபோதனரை ஏவி. So the next part refers to that abidance in the self. Thaluvu Sivanyanam. Sivanyanam is the wisdom of Shiva, which is to abide in the self, and that's meant as Thaluvu. That act of embracing. Tabodanar is referring to an ascetic, or one who's renounced all material actions, or actions commanded by the ego. Thaluvu Sivanyana Tabodanarai Avi. Avi is to command. And with that, the section of Mickkavachagar's life, he passes temporarily, Muruganar, and refers to himself in the next two lines. Manavasagam kadandum matta manappeyen sunavasagam virinda Sokka Peruman. Sokka Peruman is Sokkanadar, the name of the Lord who resides in Madurai temple is Sokkanadar, or Meenakshi Sundarar, the Lord of Meenakshi. Sokkanadar is referring to Lord Ramana here, and Muruganar says, Manavasagam Kadandum, you exist beyond the restless chatter of the mind. Manavasagam is those thoughts that appear as the mind. You exist away from it, transcending that. Yet, Mattamana Payan Sonavasagam Virenda, yet you graciously listen to this lowly being. Payan is a ghost. Mattamana Payan is the confused mind of this ghost. He refers to himself in low terms here. Sonavasaham, the words uttered by this confused being is heard by Sokka Peruman, who is Lord Ramana here. So the whole section is referring to Lord Ramana's Leela, who is Lord Shiva here, who is referred to as Sokka Peruman. And although he commanded Mickkavachagar, who was completely abiding in the self, renounced his ministerial duties and gave up any material engagements in lieu of engaging in the duties of Lord Shiva as commanded by him. And Muruganar refers to himself as a ghost who has not yet renounced his mind, whose mind is constantly confusing him. Yet he composes these verses, and Lord Ramana willingly listens to them despite him transcending and living beyond the mind or away from the mind or the source of the mind. So there's also a beautiful Tamil metaphor here. Varambelava mettu. This is Muruganar's reference to infinity. Varambelavam, as we said earlier, was boundless or boundaryless existence. It is referring to the 8 forms, also referring to the letter or the number 8, which is written in such a way that it becomes infinity. In fact, numbers 1 through 9, 8 is the only number in which the infinite curve exists, because there's no end and there's no beginning, therefore it's infinite. So in addition to referring to the 8 forms that are manifested by the Lord, he's also referring to that in a poetic way as Varambilavam Ettu. So Varambilavam Ettu Vadivadal Katti அமைச்சர் பெருமை அரசர்க்கு உணர்த்தி தமை சிவ வாழ்க்கைக்கே சரிக்க விடுத்து அப்பால் அழகுமலி தில்லை பொன்னம்பலம் சார்கென்ன தழுவு சிவஞான தபோதனரை ஏவி மனவாசகம் கடந்து மத்தமன பேயின் சுனவாசகம் விழைந்த சொக்கப் பெருமான். So we will see from line numbers 38 through 40. யாரை நீர் மாயம் செய்தீர் என்று அடிகளை வேந்து உள்ளம் காய்ந்து ஆற்ற ஒருத்தலுமே வையை கண் வெள்ளம் பாய்ந்து ஊர்மேல் விரைவதனை தட்க அடியார் இறந்த குறை ஆண்டானாம் தன் பொன்முடியால் நிறைவேற்றும் மோத தயாமூர்த்தி அனநியமா தன்னை அடைந்த சரணத்தால் கனநியமச் சான்றோரும் கண்டுகொள்ளத்தக்காள் முதுவந்திக்கு ஆளாய் முயன்று முடிமேலே மதுவந்த பிட்டுக்கு மண் சுமக்கலுற்று பிறம்படி தான் உண்ட விசித்திரத்தால் தானே வரம்பிலவாம் 8 வடிவாதல் காட்டி அமைச்சர் பெருமை அரசர்க்கு உணர்த்தி தமைச்சிவ வாழ்க்கைக்கே சரிக்க விடுத்து அப்பால் அழகுமலி தில்லை பொன்னம்பலம் சார்கென்ன தழுவு சிவஞான போதனரை ஏவி மனவாசகம் கடந்து மத்தமனப் பேயேன் சுனவாசகம் விழைந்த சொக்கப் பெருமான். With that, let's pause here to see if you had any questions. We are ending at line number 54 today, and we will continue the rest next week. And let me pause if you had any questions. Seeing or not hearing any questions, we will end today's session. Hope to see you next week.
I had asked a question, Hari.
Oh, sorry.
I
Please
was
go.
wondering when Appar was saying Devu Seivom Saivanum, is he referring to a specific example like Ravana, who is a Shiva devotee, who is also very pious, but he was, like a Rakshasa? Is he giving a specific, is he referring to a specific example, or is it sort of a general statement? That's what I posted there.
I think in this particular one, it's a generic statement, but although Appar himself has referred to Ravana's episode in other verses, in which he had said that Ravana, who was, although a devotee of Shiva, became a demon, and he was absorbed into his fold eventually by Lord Rama in part because of his devotion and in part because he was completely devious and was driven by his desires to acquire Sita, and also in part because he was driven by his tendencies or vasanas. So he did refer to Lord Ravana, Demon Lord Ravana somewhere else. However, in this particular verse where he says Nariye Kudure Sevanam Naragare Devu Sevanam, he referred to a example of where the Lord who converted jackals into horses is the same Lord who converted those who belong to hell also into pious celestials. So I don't think this particular one is referring to that, but in general, he had called upon Ravana in multiple places.
Thank you. And moreover, I was also debating because Ramana to begin with was a Shiva devotee who became, the devious way came later. So it does not fit him exactly this definition of from Naraga to Devasevonum, because he was already a Devasevon and then he became sort of a Naraga. Then probably he went back there. So may not fit that thing, but I was just wondering whether it refers to anyone specific or was it a general statement? But thanks for explaining.
Thank you. Seeing no other questions, we will see next week. Om Namo Bhagavate Sri Ramanaya.
Namaskar. Excellent. Thank you.
Thank you, Hariji.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.